Welcome to this explainer. Let's dive right in. I want you to imagine a vast, immense territory known as the North Sea Empire. We're talking about a domain that stretched all the way across England, over to Denmark, and right on through to Norway. It was absolutely one of the mightiest empires in the world during its time, and right at the center of it all was a ruler named King Canute. For hundreds and hundreds of miles, everyone was a subject of the king, completely bound to obey his every single command.
So, picture his daily life in the castle. Dozens of footmen, servants, and heralds flocked around the king constantly, acting almost like eager little ducklings following his every move. Whenever his shoulders felt even slightly tired, he wouldn't hesitate for a second. He'd just call out, "The king's shoulders are tired, a back rub immediately." And just like that, the royal court would scramble to summon the very finest masseuse in the land to rub his shoulders until he simply decided he was finished.
Or, right between lunch and dinner, he might suddenly yell, "The king is hungry!" He'd demand a roast chicken stuffed with fresh bread and the absolute finest herbs from the garden. The royal chef would leap into action, the whole kitchen would just bustle with energy, and not even a half hour later, a fresh roast chicken would appear perfectly presented on a golden tray right at the king's table. Get this, one day he decided some of his servants' haircuts were sloppy. He bellowed that they looked like a bunch of scruffy goat herders and commanded, "All of you shave your heads and be quick about it!" And they leaped to obey. They snipped their hair right down to the stubble, took soap and razors, and shaved it completely clean until they were all as bald as eggs. This was literally just a normal, everyday occurrence in the castle.
Well, one afternoon, as the king sat on his throne, a gentle summer breeze drifted in through the open window. It was warm, it was gentle, and it carried with it the distinct hints of the not-too-distant ocean. Breathing it in, he suddenly bellowed that he desired to be carried to the sea. He wanted to watch the waves and smell that good salt air.
At his command, the court became an absolute flurry of motion. In the very first hour, they assembled a litter, this massive, luxurious throne mounted on long wooden beams so his servants could actually carry him on their shoulders. By hour 2, the cooks had quickly prepared an extravagant picnic feast. And by hour 3, lords and ladies had gathered, knights formed up to guard the parade, and the whole procession set out down the cobbled path under the warm late summer sun.
But as they ambled down the winding way, boom, they hit a roadblock. Down in the mud, a group of men were brawling. They were stripped right down to the waist, wrestling in the dirt, cheering loudly and causing a huge commotion. A knight rode his horse right into the middle of them and shouted for them to clear the road. But the muddy men didn't even care. One of them, just brushing mud off his knuckles, told the knight they were the king's soldiers doing a training exercise, and told him to ride back and go slay a dragon or something, while the rest of the men hooted and jeered.
Seeing this, the servants brought the litter right to the front of the parade, and the king called out this rhyming command. "The king desires you stand aside, and the king's desires he gets. Whosoever stands still with pride earns a lashing he never forgets." Hearing that voice, the soldiers immediately went pale. They started trembling under all that mud. Their leader stammered an apology, snapped to a stiff, straight bearing, and hurriedly ordered his men out of the way. They scurried right out of the path as the king's litter passed on by.
The parade kept moving down the wide roads, the warm breeze blowing, armor clinking and clanking. After a few miles, the air suddenly took on a brand new odor. It was tangy and sweet. Following the scent, they found a small group of farmers in a field alongside the road harvesting strawberries. The farmers were gently plucking each berry from the low, tangled greenery, carefully placing them into wide, shallow baskets so that the weight of the fruit on top wouldn't crush the delicate berries sitting beneath them.
Unable to resist that intoxicating scent, King Canute called out that he desired some berries. The parade halted and servants swarmed the field. But they were met with unexpected resistance. A tall, gangly woman boldly stepped right up, pushed the swarming royal servants back, and demanded to know who they thought they were. "These are our berries," she said. "You can buy them at the market like everyone else."
The king simply scowled down at them from his litter. He sang his rhyming song once again, just swapping out a few words. "The king desires berries," he eyed, "and the king's desires he gets. Whosoever hoards food with pride earns a lashing he never forgets." The farmer's eyes went wide in realization. They quickly backed away and offered all the strawberries the king wanted. He motioned for his servants to take the baskets, and they moved on, without him offering a single coin for the harvest. However, a passing lord in his parade secretly took pity on the farmers and quietly handed them some money for their fruit.
Eventually, the clatter of the road faded, replaced by the sound of crashing waves. Gulls were crying and wheeling through the air, and salty spray erupted over distant rocks. The parade followed a crooked, sandy path right through tall grass and emerged onto a stunning beach with pale golden sand. Breathing the sweet salt air deep into his lungs, the king ordered his throne placed right by the water's edge. While the king watched the waves, the rest of the party spread blankets, ate the prepared lunch, swam in the chill waters, and built elaborate sandcastles on the beach.
A few pleasant hours passed like this. Then the tide began to come in, and the water crept higher and higher up the beach. A servant approached the king and nervously pointed out that the beach would soon be completely covered at high tide, suggesting they pack up and leave. But the king dismissively waved him off. He stated clearly that he was not done, reminding the servant that he was the king and everyone obeys his command.
The rest of the royal parade retreated safely up the beach and prepared to head home. But the king stayed right where he was. He sat and relaxed on his throne, completely ignoring the rising ocean. He waited until the crashing waves physically reached him, soaking right into his fine leather shoes and thoroughly wetting the bottom of his royal robes. Looking down at his wet clothes, he simply declared the situation to be entirely unacceptable. He shouted out over the unyielding water, commanding the tides to stop. He bellowed, "The king desires to halt the tide, and the king's desires he gets." But his song simply echoed out over the water. The waves completely ignored him. In fact, they came faster and higher, climbing right up over the seat of the throne itself, soaking the king even further as he demanded to know if the ocean heard him.
And then his words were abruptly cut off. A massive, towering wave swept completely over him, knocking him end over end. Suddenly, the great king of the North Sea Empire found himself upside down, entirely underwater. He got a massive mouthful of salt and sand, struggling to find his footing, sputtering and spitting, only to be immediately knocked back down by another relentless wave crashing against the shore.
Seeing the danger, his knights gravely waded into the churning water. They grabbed the king and dragged him completely out of the surf before it could get too deep for him to stand. They laid him out in the tall grass where he hacked and coughed up what looked like a gallon of ocean water. The king sat up, shivering, completely pale, and thoroughly tossed around by the overwhelming force of the ocean waters. The servants rushed over, looking out at the wooden throne that was now entirely submerged at the edge of the waving sea. They asked the shivering king if they should go out and retrieve the litter to carry him home. The king looked at the submerged throne and then back at his court. He told them to leave it. He simply said, "I think it might do me well to walk for a change." So, back on his own 2 feet, the king retraced his steps. When he encountered the farmers again, he apologized to them and paid them for their strawberries in gold. When he passed the soldiers, he apologized to them as well, promising to build them new barracks where they could gather and train properly. And finally, upon returning to the castle, he formally apologized to all his servants for his previously overbearing requests. From that day forward, his daily behavior shifted. Instead of his standard absolute command, "The king desires," he began asking his court, "May I please?" He simply changed his words and found that the results from the staff, the kitchen, and the court were just as prompt, and the people around him were much happier. The great king of the North Sea Empire continued his reign for many years. His dominion remained vast and his power immense. But the day he sat before the unyielding ocean and walked home entirely dripping wet became the story his people remembered forever. So, it leaves us to wonder, when absolute command meets the unyielding tide, what is left behind in the sand? Thanks for joining us for this explainer, and we'll see you next time.